Hello everyone, and welcome to the final part of building our simple Dropbox clone using Deno KV and Supabase. Only thing left for us is to handle deleting files and deleting folders. So let's get started. We can head over to the DB file, which contains all our database functions. We want to add two new functions, one for deleting files and one for deleting folders. Let's start with the folder one. We create a new async function called delete folder that takes an ID of type string, which represents the ID of the folder. We'll create an object, result, that has an OK field initialized to false. We do this because when we do the delete operation on the Deno KV instance, it'll return a similar object telling us if it succeeded or not. So while it hasn't succeeded, if for some reason Deno KV call failed, we'll keep trying. We'll first get the folder that we're looking for. We check if it's null, in which case we don't need to do anything. Otherwise, we make an atomic operation and delete the folder's key and the folders by parent folder key. So we're basically wanting to get rid of our primary index and of our secondary index. For folders by parent folder, we need to make sure that the keys have the parent folder key as well as the current folder that we're trying to delete, the current ID of that folder. And finally, then we just hit the commit on that function. And that's all we need to delete a folder. For the delete files, it's mostly identical. Our function is going to be called delete file. It'll take in an ID of string. We do the same thing by creating our result object and looping over it as long as it hasn't succeeded. We just need to make sure that we're getting a file, like the current file that we're looking for, and making sure that the type is fresh file instead of folder. If the file is null, then we don't have to do anything. Otherwise, we delete the primary index, which is files and ID, and the secondary index, which the key is files by parent folder, the parent folder ID, and the ID. The DB functions are ready. We can now set up the function that will remove our stored files from Supabase. So we'll head over to our supaupload.ts file. We'll create a new async function called remove file. This will take in the fresh file that we want to remove from Supabase. To remove a file from our bucket, it's actually pretty easy. We use the storage client and select the bucket from which we want to remove, which our case is folders. And then we call the remove function by passing it the path that we want to get rid of, which is the parent folder ID / the file ID. That's how we represented it in Supabase. Now, this can return an error, and I'm not really going to handle those errors. If you want to, and if you're doing something a bit more than just a toy project, you should definitely handle them. But for our case, it's good enough to simply console log if any error occurred. Okay, so we're ready with our functions. We now need three more things. We'll need to create two API routes and an island component. The API routes will call our database and Supabase functions to actually do the delete operations. And our island component will represent our delete button and call our routes whenever there's a click. Since we're executing some TypeScript, whenever there's a click, we need to use an island component. So let's start with the API routes. I'll just make sure to save those files first. The first route that we'll create will handle deleting files. So inside of our routes folder, under API, we'll create a new file called file.txt. .tsx. We import the handlers from Fresh and the Fresh file interface along with the db function to delete a file and the Supabase function to remove the file from our storage. We'll create the handler const. We'll have only one handler for the delete method. So whenever we make an API call and our method is delete, this will get triggered. The request body will contain the file that we want to delete. So to get that information, we can do so by doing request.json and parsing it as a fresh file. Then all we need to do is call the remove file function by passing it the file that we just got from our request. This will execute the Supabase function that we just created and remove it from our bucket. Once that's completed, we'll call delete file, which will end up deleting the file from Deno KV by passing it the ID of our file. And last thing we want to do is return a 200 status response saying remove file successfully. Now, you probably noticed no error handling. I made that decision because I'm mostly just trying to show the basic idea of dealing with our files and folders and deleting them. And I'm also lazy. I also just noticed that I have an error importing my files and functions. That's because for some reason I added an extra ... slash. All right, all better now. So the second route that we'll be creating is for our folders. So under API, which is under routes, we'll create a new file called folder.tsx. Folder deletion is a bit more interesting since a folder can contain other folders and files. Whenever we delete one, we also want to make sure to delete all the files in it and all the folders and their contents as well. So if we look at our app, if we end up deleting books, we don't want to just get rid of this folder. We also want to actually, books is empty. Let's do it with movies. If we end up deleting movies, we also want to delete Nicolas Cage folder. And we also want to delete Lord of War folder. We also want to delete whatever was in that folder. To do so, let's just first import our handlers and the folder interface. We're also going to import a bunch of functions from our database functions. So we'll want to delete the file, delete the folder, and we also want the functions to get files by parent ID and get folders by parent ID. We also want the remove file from the Supabase upload function. This will allow us to get rid of the file completely. Whenever we delete a folder, we want to get rid of all the files inside of that folder. So then we create our handler const. And similar to the files route, we're only going to handle the delete operation. We get from the request body the folder, same as what we did for files. We then call a magic function called delete all folder, which we'll create in a bit, and pass it the folder that we just got from the request body. This will handle deleting all files and folders and the content from those folders, which can be other files and folders. And finally, we'll return a 200 status response. So let's implement delete all folder function. I'll create an async function, which takes in the current folder that we're trying to delete everything inside of. If we think about it for a second, we basically want to get all the files and folders for our current folder that we're looking at that needs to be deleted. And then we want to delete that current folder and all its files. And then we want to recursively do the exact same thing if it had any other folders. Going the recursive route makes it very simple. So like we said, we first get all the subfolders by calling getFoldersByParentID for our current folder. And we do the exact same thing for files. So we get all the files under this folder and all the folders under this folder. We'll then iterate over all these files. And similar to our files API route, we'll call remove file to delete the file from Supabase, and then we'll call delete file to remove that from Deno KV. Then we'll call delete folder, which is going to get rid of our current folder. All that's left is to recursively delete all the subfolders that we have here. So to do so, we're just going to loop over each subfolder and call the same function, delete all folder, for that one. And that's it. So we'll hit save. The last thing that we need is our new island component. Under our island folder, I'll create a new file called deletebutton.csx. This will represent a delete button component that whenever pressed will delete the file if it was pressed on a file. If pressed on a folder, it'll delete a folder. First, we'll import our file and folder interfaces. We then create this component's prop interface called deletebuttonProps. It'll take two things, either a file, which can be a fresh file or null, or a folder, which can be a folder or null. We then export our button component and get these props as parameters. We'll create two helper functions to call our API endpoints. First is onDeleteFile, which is an async function that takes in a file. We set the API URL to call, which is API/file. We'll then make a fetch request to that API URL. The method will be delete, and the body will just be the file object that we got stringified. Based off of the response, if the response is a status 200, we'll reload the current page that we're looking at. For our second handler, it's essentially going to be the same thing. Our handler will be onDeleteFolder, async, and we'll take in a folder. We'll set up the URL, which will be API/folder. We'll make the same thing, make a fetch request to that URL, method delete, and the folder as the body. Based off of the response status, if it's 200, we'll refresh the page. Finally, we return our JSX element. This is just a button with an onClick function. This method will check that if the file, which is from our props here, if this file is not null, then we want to call the onDelete file on it. Otherwise, it means that folder is not null. And we have some CSS to make the button text red, and the text itself is just delete. We can now replace the buttons that we have in table folder for this component file. So we can now use delete button. If we head over to our components folder and table folder, we'll see that we have here essentially a useless button link. So we'll remove this and use our delete button link that we just created. Let's just make sure that we auto import the new island component. Now this is supposed to take a file and a folder. Since here we're iterating over all the subfolders, and so we have a bunch of folders, the file will be null and the folder will be whichever current folder we're looking at. We'll do the same thing for when we map over files. So we'll take this, replace this link that does nothing, and we'll just reverse this. This should be null, and files should be provided. And now we're ready to test it out. So if we head over to our page, let's just open the console to make sure nothing goes wrong. So we can see here we have a book folder which has nothing. in it. So let's try and delete that. If we hit delete, we see that it just disappears. That's because it was deleted from Deno KV and then we reloaded the page since we got a 200 status response from our API route. Now here we have this tulip image. So if we head back, let's try and delete that file. And we see that that file got deleted successfully. Same thing with the my recipe. Let's try and delete that. And they should be gone. Now here we have a bunch of folders that are nested. Same thing, we can try and delete that and we should have everything gone. One last thing, just to make sure that all the files folders have been deleted successfully when we're deleting it recursively, I just created this function that will console log everything. So basically it iterates over everything inside of our folders key and console logs it. It iterates everything under folders by parent folder, like the prefix. So it'll give us everything for these ones and same thing for files and just console log it. And then I went into the index route and whenever it first loads, I just output everything that was in our database. So now if we head over here and hit refresh and look at our server console, ideally we should see nothing, which means that we successfully deleted everything. Now just to make sure that it's working properly, if we add something, you see now we added a new folder. Now if we look at our console, we see two instances of our folder. One of them is under the folder prefix, the other one is under folders by parent ID prefix, and the parent ID in this case is home. So now if we delete it and then look at this, let's refresh it just to make sure we're not showing the previously one, and we refresh, nothing is being outputted, and so our recursive deletion was successful and actually did delete everything. Thanks a lot for watching all the way to this final part. We completed our simple Dropbox clone, which allows us to create a folder structure using Deno KV and to store files thanks to Supabase. Thanks again for watching and bye!